Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns, and this is Tom Navolis, your host. And as you know, those anti-federalists did absolutely get it correct. And we have a lot to cover, more than usual, because last week I had to delay the program based on all the various research that I was doing to bring you this program this week. The title of this program is Speaker Johnson's Failures Leading to Complete Economic Thralldom, Herding the CIN. And I have that as CIN, which I'll explain a little bit further down. Now, what we have here is that Speaker Johnson is hurting the CIN problem in the House of Representatives, but we have to look at a larger context in that we will deal with this CIN, especially those that are looking at the posting and the context for all the references at samueladamsreturns.net. You'll find that in the rest of the story. Now, the reality of all this failure really began in the pulpits. And the reason I'm saying this in particular is because what we're seeing that the congressional members are identifying as Christian. You're going to have to look at the reference number 3, the Pew Report that I'm citing as the primary impetus for this week's program, because what we have in there is that Congress in general, the great majority of Congress, identify as Christian. So that must mean that we are being led by National Christian Congress, or is it a Christian National Congress? I'm not making light of this at all, but when you think about what people claim to be and how things really are, well, there's such a difference that I have to take this position of failure for Speaker Johnson in that the economic policies, as well as the majority of legislation being brought forward for passage in the House, is not in alignment with his adult life efforts with the Alliance of Defending Freedom, nor the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. He is not alone in these failures by any means whatsoever. No, he is failed and continues to fail both in policy and law. The particular failure stamping and stampeding the citizenry into this economic thralldom that we're experiencing. You have to consider, how long has Speaker Johnson been in the House of Representatives? We'll touch on that in a little bit. And how long have many of these other members who identify as Christian been in Congress? And look at where the country is. In particular, the Democrats who identify as Christian. Who's their God? Where are they giving allegiance to, and how is it that they are taking and acting for the best interest of the nation and the citizenry based on their theology? They are. That's the point. Their God is not the God at the founding of the nation. And we'll really have to pick up on that next week. So their gods, in many cases, pluralism, are those that not only are leading us into the destructive economic thralldom, but in every other aspect of what is occurring in this country. They are not traitors to the Constitution. They are sinfully disobedient, but believers in their theology for their God and acting accordingly. Now, what I wanted to bring here is that what we have going on is that there are numerous Protestants and a few Catholics in Congress who definitely identify with a God religion and act and vote according to that theology, as I already mentioned. Along with these National Congressional Christians, now this is important, don't forget the multitude of bureaucrats across all of governance, even into state government, that identify as Christian. Those that sit on the bench that identify as Christian. Those in law enforcement that identify as Christian. Those in the other bureaucracies at the federal level in particular that identify as Christian. They don't act any way as what that term actually means. All right, down the rabbit hole. Regarding this topic of economic thralldom or economic theology and Congress members identifying as Christian is a major rabbit hole. So that's what took me so long in bringing this program together. And there's no way on this planet that we're going to be able to cover that in any simple manner in these 3 segments. You're definitely going to have to look at the references there at SamuelAdamsReturns.net to get all of it. And those who do not get the second segment, I highly recommend that you make sure that you listen to the whole podcast or videos and definitely go to the references that I already mentioned. Now, additionally, there's a lot of information with and as to what is meaningful and the resolutions that Speaker Johnson has sponsored. Those are in the references. You can go look at his legislative record. You can look at his voting record. And quite frankly, none of it's really meaningful. Most of these people, that it's just not really meaningful on what he has accomplished for the people. Maybe one of his big accomplishments is a post office there in Louisiana. But this is just typical for the establishment feel good or tweaking on stuff. So again, go to the references and see what he has done. All I can assess respecting Speaker Johnson and the 118th Congress is more of the same road apples and a parade with no shovels and buckets to follow and clean it all up. So, you know what's going on with all the people taking and walking in that parade afterwards. Can you imagine? Think about this one just as a side note. There it is, all the horses in the parade, road apples all over the place, and you got this marching band in great formation that cannot break formation, will not break formation. I'll let that picture sink in with you for a little bit. Anyway, I wanted to go on with this, and this quote is not out of place for this week. And you have to completely understand, and you will shortly, all of the context of this and that of Congress being Christian. Now, Sam Adams wrote this, and quote, "This was the dire effect of their foolish adulation of their governor. While they possessed to observe a day set apart in honor to the King of Kings, their thanksgiving began with profaneness and ended in idolatry. Or rather, it began and ended with both. So there's no question, but the priests were the vicegerents of the governor, or his heralds to publish his impious proclamations to the people. But is it not strange that the people were so king-ridden and priest-ridden, especially in matters which concerned their religion, as to look upon the joint authority of their governor and clergy sufficient to justify them in sinning against the authority of God himself, and in acting in open violation to his laws, God's laws, revealed to them from heaven with signs and miracles at Mount Sinai, and registered in their book of the law, as well as engraved in the tablets of their hearts. End quote. I think that has a lot to say of all of those who say they are Christian and identify as Christian in Congress. They are idolaters. They sin against God, and everything that they're doing is with profaneness and ends up in idolatry. No wonder we're under judgment. So where are we? It seems to be generally felt and acknowledged that the affairs of this country are in a ruinous situation. With vast resources in our hands, we are impoverished by the continual drain of money from us in foreign trade. Our navigation is destroyed. Our people are in debt and unable to pay. Industry is at a stand. Our public treaties are violated, and national faith solemnly plighted to foreigners and to our own citizens is no longer kept. We are discontented at home, and abroad we are insulted and despised. Folks, that's a quote. The Philadelphia Freeman's Journal, May 16, 1787. Isn't that something that we can even hear at a Trump rally? You can hear some conservative congressman saying, you hear that on news that truly understands the plight of this nation. Wow. Here's where we are. So those who know and or understand that we have a federal government and a shadow government functioning outside of the designated constitutional limits see the present budgeting and financing government activities as further destruction of the liberties of the citizenry. Congressman Chip Roy sums it up here in an interview with Shahil Copper, and I'll just go real quick, is that the newly passed government funding bill, which was the extension bill that was passed, was more the same games, a lot of smoke and mirrors. And he predicted that the next package of bills will similarly be garbage. Roy said, I think the speaker reflects a conference that likes to give lip service, and this is Speaker Johnson, likes to give lip service to the fiscal restraints and refuses to act on it. That's what I think. In the same article, Rep. Ralph Norman summed it up. He, Speaker Johnson, inherited a lot of this. No, I don't blame him, Norman said. It's like herding cats up here. Well, I have to say, it's herding the CIN, the CIN. And we're going to get more into that and look at the facts and the realities that the Anti-Federalists did predict exactly this if we lost religion, being the true Christian Reformation religion, and we lost the virtue. At the end of the program, or at the end of the posting, you'll see the quotes from Sam Adams in relationship to the founder's perspective and Sam Adams' perspective early on in relationship to what real religion is. Come on back. Welcome back to the second segment. We're going to pick up and jump right back into the quotes that I gave you just a few moments ago, where both Representative Roy and Representative Norman had summed up what was going on with the extended bill that passed and then looking forward into this new budget. Now, granted that Speaker Johnson said that the president's budget is dead on arrival, but he's already been in there negotiating with Chuck Schumer and the establishment Republicans in the Senate as to how to contrive another monstrosity that will continue us down the road and into the thralldom, deeper into thralldom, to which we already are. And our children and grandchildren will be. Oh, do you know what thralldom is? Yes, you're right. Slavery. We're now in a form of economic, cultural, and political slavery. So as I've noted in many other programs, all governance, which encompasses policies, laws, regulations, fiscal mechanism, are morally determined by the God of the religion of the legislators, administrators, judges, and bureaucrats. What do they have? What is it? Hence, the policies and legislation regarding economics is not just moral, it is religious. And we understand that this is a leadership in Congress of Christians nationals, or National Religion of Christians. In any course, they're CIN. So I'm going to later discuss a number of Congress identifying as Christians, but let me do this for a moment. Let me leave this moment with a reference to Matthew 23:27, and then to go to the third reference in the references at the end of the program, where Congress remains far more Christian than any in the country. Denominational identity is dropping among lawmakers, but few are nuns. So one has clearly understood that those being chastised in a biblical reference, and in that in Matthew, you're going to have to go look that up. We don't have time to deal with that right now. But those are who? The Pharisees and the Sadducees are empty tombs, is what Jesus is saying. So they're being chastised. They were the political leaders, the legal leaders of the people of Israel. That's what we have now. We have these people that are calling them, identifying themselves as Christian. Few are now identifying otherwise, but not so true. So let's look at this. This is more than an opening. I mean, that's what I was doing, the opening of the program, with this idea that, first off, Speaker Johnson is failing, and he's primarily failing because he is not living in totality, and has not during his time in the National Congress. Not so sure about what he did when he was in Louisiana, but he's failing in the National Congress because a lot of the stuff he's done and votes, okay, they're there, but they're not in accordance with the principles, or as I would look at and talk about often on this program, under the auspices and sovereignty of the biblical God. He votes, as we've seen in other programs of other pastors that understand these truths of biblical reformation, foundational principles in this country, and from what I did in the last number of programs in reference to the sermons of the Revolution and that period leading up to it and during it, the political leaders and the people, which I'm going to cover more next week, were more in tune than what we have today. Our political leaders, although they identify as something, well, as you well know, in our society now, you can identify as anything. Maybe a lot of them in Congress are identifying as frogs, hoping that somehow they get kissed and turned into princes or princesses. A lot of them may be princesses. I don't know. They can identify either way nowadays. But anyway, regarding Speaker Johnson's failures, the evidence is notably spread over the last 100 years in the policies and laws that have been allowed to be implemented by himself and his predecessors, identifying as some form of a Christian. So this is egregious, an allowance of administrative bureaucracies to become a substitute ruling body that reigns unchecked tyranny across the nation and violates foundational Federalist and even anti-Federalist. They're talking about the foundational Federalist and the anti-Federalist governance principles, as well as fundamental biblical principles of liberty. They have no attachment to it. So additionally, to the policy evidence, as I've noted over the last 5 weeks of programs, our historical Christian church polity has failed our citizenry because of their theology, and their theology being a humanistic rendering of theology, not that foundational theology. Thus, they failed the elected, because the elected, look at the generational, the lives, the people's age categories in the House and Senate, in Congress. What has been going on in their pulpits over the last 50, 60, 70 years? What's been going on? So if the theology and the disconnect in teaching from the pulpits of social, cultural, and political, if there's that disconnect and it all stays spiritual, then it's exactly what the anti-federalists predicted. And so it is such a contrast between what was preached during that foundational period and what's preached now. So many of these people that identify as Christian, well, they put everything in a little box. The box of their church, the box of their Sunday school, the box of their whatever is that they attend, the box of their idolatry. They put it in that box. But when it comes to opening that box and how they're going to govern, opening that box in how laws should be established based on true moral principles, how economics and economic policy should be decided on freedom, liberty, just the foundational mechanisms within the Declaration of Independence, their theology, their ideas, their truths cannot match those fundamental foundational principles. So one striking element to my charge against Speaker Johnson's failure is that he has been accused of being a Christian nationalist. Yet, he has not developed policy and legislation to warrant such an accusation. He has compromised with the whitewashed tombs of congressional members, and now as Speaker moves forward agendas contrary to his acclaimed adult life efforts. What he is doing is continuing to pick up and take charge of the dead bones and decay of the uniparty establishment and march that, ensuring that the culture and law structured, as well as the economic thralldom of the citizenry, is continued. To be clear, I'm not being specific to the most recent continuing resolution, as we were talking about in the first segment with Representative Roy, but to the divestiture from the Speaker Johnson's favored principles of a common theme in promoting a Christian worldview. Where is that being lived out in what is going on in Congress? So my intention over the next few months is to reintroduce the citizenry from the Christian and the whole of a secular society to the foundational principles of economics. American economics was based on biblical principles, and I've been doing a lot of restudying. I've been doing a big refresher and reading many of the various works, not only from the time of the Reformation, but through our present, that are strong in core national spectrums and concepts of biblical economics. It's amazing to me of the hundreds of teachers in sociology and economics that are out there that look at this idea of economic theology. And where does the faith aspect of it fit? Where had that divestiture happen? And when did economics become secularized? When did all of what we're dealing with become secularized? To the devastation of this nation and the fact that we have invasion of thralls from other nations. Oh, so what we have is slave trade going on. We have the cartels, and it's all slave trade. If you haven't figured that out, is one nation is taking, and they're saying, oh, they're migrants. No, they're not migrants. They're slaves under the governments of their existing nations, just moving and being traded through the hands of cartels and others to enter into the thralldom of the Democrat Party and the slaves within the American United States economic system as it exists. And that's what Speaker Johnson and those that identify as Christian in Congress are failing at. So the sin is continuing to create gross sin. Now, I want you to consider is that those in political leadership across the national spectrum are ignorant or worse, ignore these truths which would keep a free, sovereign citizenry secure in their property and God-given liberties. They're not doing that because they're not going to those foundational principles. Now, I want you to keep in mind that private property and every sovereign liberty acknowledged in the Declaration of Independence has been and is now being made void or negligible by the actions of Congress. This was the big battle, my friends. This was the big battle, ladies and gentlemen, that Sam Adams started talking about back in the 1760s. This was the battle that began at the beginning of this nation, is the sovereignty, especially around property and liberties. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have going on now is this economic thralldom. What is it? $92,000 a year just going to, per family, going to illegals, you are a slave. Come on back. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this last segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists did get it right. Again, this is Tom Novolis, your host. And let me begin with this statement as a question. And that being, the majority in Congress are Christian nationalists. That's a question. And let me reference for you, which is there in the links, a Pew research that details the religious composition of the 118th Congress. This is what really has given me the impetus for this program, is when I found this research paper and these surveys of the 118th Congress, I was really set to look at why we have seen failures in Congress for so long. In this design, in this composition of the 118th Congress, very much similar to previous Congresses, a statement of fact is 469 members in Congress identify as Christian. Once again, and this is not levity. This is fact. You can identify with whatever you want to identify with anymore. So when it comes to Congress, this has been going on for decades. So when it comes to all this immorality identification, disgusting immoral identification, well, the fact of the matter is Congress has been doing it for decades, maybe 100 years or so. But that fact still remains that 469 members identify as Christian. Of these, 303 are grouped into the general category of Protestant. Would you not think that by these numbers, we should be seeing policies and leadership as what Reverend Ezra Stiles called a Christian republic? Wouldn't that be Christian nationalism? Wouldn't you think that based on all of these that are identifying, especially 303 that would identify as Protestant Christians, that they would be looking at the sovereignty of God in everything that they do, in the way that they look at law, at policy? Should we not be seeing leadership of Christian nationalists just by virtue of this survey alone? By looking at what and who these people identify as? Yet we see that to identify as something, as I've mentioned over and over already, is of now a vogue in meaning, but to be, in essence, whatever you really want to be, or the opposite of what you identify as. So if we take general society at this point in time and consider that these 303 members, 469 members are identifying as Christian, then based on what is going on in the immoral aspects of society, these identified Christians in Congress are opposite of what they say they are. Totally rational in our present environment, in our present insanity. Rational? I wonder. So in this discussion that we've been having, and I'm looking at it as an opening discussion of what we're going to be talking about over some next period of time, is that we delve deeper into economic thralldom, or as Hayek says, the road to serfdom. And there's a link there at samueladamsreturns.net in this posting to the road to serfdom and a video explanation and component of that. So attempting to stay focused. I've had a hard time, obviously you can tell that I had a hard time staying focused and even putting this together. I tried to stay focused on the religious composition of Congress as well as the leadership of Speaker Johnson, respecting the history of American economics. But as I begin this week with the introduction of the book, it's called The Enterprising American, A Business History of the United States by John Chamberlain, and it was originally written in 1959. Now, I didn't even get to just not even a crystal of ice in the tip of the iceberg in relationship to that book. So this book, as well as others, as I've mentioned before, on biblical economics is available. And I have a link to it there at the end of the blog post. The average citizen would take for granted all of those religious elected in Congress would act according to, as I mentioned before, the sovereignty of God. But wait a minute. They do act according to the sovereignty of their gods. But to which God is it that they're making these decisions? We have others who call it the religion of humanism, the religion of economics, because economic theology, the religion of environmentalism. Each of those has their god or gods. So now we have pantheism. Christianity in Congress is defined by pantheism. Many gods, many religions. Not the foundational Christian, biblical, Reformation religion of the founding of this nation. All right, I got to get to the rest of the story here. I only have a few minutes left. And so Speaker Johnson fails to begin with the sin. His failures begin with the sin, Christians in name, and lack of living according to the sovereignty of the biblical God. Even himself, his policies, his leadership is personal in that box. But when it comes to the greater positioning of what that means and how he acts, the question is, where's the sovereignty of the biblical God in that? So the complexity of Congress is from the pulpits. That's where that complexity is derived since the early 1800s, losing their foundational Reformation principles and theology. The 19th century modernism with humanism in the lead disassociates God's sovereignty from governance, education, business, and culture. We have this total disassociation there. So it's not just the varying theologies of the 400, or I should say the 303 Protestants in Congress, but the theological bending even of Adam Smith that moderns gloom onto. I have been taking a dive into a book, the Rutledge Handbook of Economic Theology by Stefan Schwarzkopf. It's interesting, a very interesting book. It's a conglomeration study, research of economic theology across many facets. He does a fabulous job. But just in the introduction alone, on page 4, he brings out this, that comprising historical and contemporary theoretical and empirical elements, economic theology can thus be defined as follows. It is the study of the forms of interaction between theological imaginaries on the one hand and economic thought and economic managerial practices on the other, both past and present. It identifies explicit and implicit theologies inherent in economic concepts, institutions, and practices, as well as the role of economic terminology within theological thought, both past and present. Economic theology is thus not merely the study of religious teachings about economic problems. Economic theology understands the economic economy and the theological as intimately connected rather than as separate subjects. So therefore, the 303 Protestants, along with the 148 Catholics in Congress, have proven what is evident, that their theology, especially the economic theology, can be all over the map. It can be all over the map. Regardless, and we take this from a philosophical point of view that we'll talk about some more next week, is regardless of what Thomas Aquinas taught on economic theory, most Catholics, as John D. Mueller writes regarding American Catholics, quote, exhibit the attention span of fruit flies when their faith impinges on their politics, end quote. They are totally unaware of the basic, quote, just price theory of Thomas Aquinas, end quote, or even those fundamental concepts of, quote, utility and function, end quote, in the economic assessments of Augustine of Hippo. So hence CIN, CIN, is actively participating in CIN, SIN, which leads to complete economic thralldom, as well as every aspect of creating national thralls of those who are under their power. Theology matters, but who is the religion and God of those in Congress? Is it the state? I want to bring out just a final point here, so I don't have much more time in the last 2 minutes. So this final point for now is that I'm going to be following up in the next week with another Pew Report regarding the decline of religion in the U.S. The simple fact is that our founders tied liberty to biblical Christianity for morality, virtue, and governance. Without true biblical religion, as we are seeing it now, the Constitution, law, justice, and liberty mean nothing. They mean nothing. So I'm attempting to not take the following out of context regarding economics and theology. The Pew Report identifies the majority of congressional members as Christian, yet their disparate theologies of the vast majority have been grossly secularized in an effort to keep everything short here. And I have only 1 minute left, so we're not even going to get through this. When you study the theological underpinnings of economics and the economy, we need to differentiate between explicit and implicit theological imaginaries. The former include forms of banking, finance, and so on. They're explicit. And then you can get into the implicit. But I take you through the paragraph, and thus, economic theology is in danger of being reduced to anti- or pro-capitalistic polemic if it does not call to and out the existence of new gods and new religions, and if it does not able to define itself as a critical method. As a method, economic theology helps identify the explicit but economic theology can destroy without a biblical God. See you next week.